Welcome to Context. This is Brad Harris. Today, we're discussing the book Scientific Culture and the Making of the Industrial West by the historian of science Margaret Jacob. Scientific Culture and the Making of the Industrial West was published in 1997, and it remains a standard text in undergraduate college courses on the history of science and the Industrial Revolution. I used this book myself as both an undergraduate and graduate student to better understand the historical relationship between science and technology. Margaret Jacob's major scholarly contribution was in helping us to understand how scientific knowledge first became integrated into the culture of Europe through the 1600s and 1700s, and how the different social and political conditions of different European countries influenced the application of science to material prosperity. Ultimately, this enhances our understanding of the role of science in the Industrial Revolution and provides deeper insight on why Britain's distinctive approach to the utility of science enabled it to industrialize generations earlier than any other country. Now, we inaugurated Context by considering Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which revealed environmental factors supporting Eurasian society's rise to global power. But Diamond's book was such a big-picture view of history that it left us wondering why Europeans in particular, the most backward of Eurasian societies 1,000 years ago, raced ahead of everyone else in the centuries since. So, in our second episode, we turn to David Landy's epic book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, to better understand how Europe's unique cultural values of curiosity, novelty, and private property, along with its unique political fragmentation, cultivated European discovery and innovation, and ultimately established progress, rather than stability, as Northwest Europe's preeminent cultural value. And yet, as much as Landy's book enlightened us on Eurasia's shifting patterns of power toward Northwest Europe, we were still left wondering how Britain, unlike any other country in history, succeeded in establishing the most important feature of modernity, namely, making the pursuit of knowledge profitable. Here in our third episode, Margaret Jacob's book attends to this. She starts the book with a simple claim, quote, "By 1750, roughly the same scientific knowledge had become available in all the major languages of Europe, but it was taken up differently. In other words, the context of discovery or dissemination is very important in the history of science and its role in early industrialization. Indeed, I shall be arguing that, from at least as early as the mid-1600s, British science came wrapped in an ideology that encouraged material prosperity." End quote. When the scientific revolution officially kicked off in Europe in the year 1543 with the publication of Nicholas Copernicus's theory that the Earth revolved around the sun, Britain was still a relatively weak nation. Italy, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, they were all richer and more powerful. Yet, less than 250 years later, at the end of the 1700s, Britain was the richest and most powerful nation in the world. How? The scientific revolution had blossomed through that interval of time, culminating with Isaac Newton's publication of his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy in 1687. Much of the new knowledge that became available was mechanical, from Galileo's insights on the relationship between time, speed, and distance of falling objects, and Robert Boyle's discoveries on the effects of pressure and volume of gases, to Evangelista Torricelli's demonstration of vacuums and Newton's laws of motion. The array of discoveries that scientific revolutionaries were making certainly supported radically new philosophies about the human condition, but they also offered new possibilities for building radically new kinds of machines, and herein lay the key to Britain's ascendance. From the very inception of modern science, The British tended to interpret it through the development of new technology, while much of the rest of Europe, at least initially, tended to interpret it through the development of new philosophy. Why this difference existed comprises the bulk of Jacob's book. For starters, Jacob reiterates the link between Protestantism and progress. Galileo's trial by the Catholic Inquisition in particular was a flashpoint in mobilizing opposition to Catholic tyranny and shifting scientific progress to Protestant strongholds in Northwest Europe. After enthusiastically publishing about his discoveries with his telescope, through which he saw moons orbiting Jupiter, spots on the Sun, mountains and valleys on our own moon, and moon-like phases on Venus, Galileo had become something of a scientific celebrity in Europe, and he used his influence to popularize Copernicus's theory that the Sun, not the Earth, was the center of the known universe. This claim contradicted Catholic dogma, which held that everything revolved around us. And so, in 1633, Galileo was hauled before Catholic authorities in Rome and convicted of heresy. His books were banned, and Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. He got off easy. He had powerful friends, among whom was Cardinal Caesar Baronius, who argued in Galileo's defense that, quote, "The Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go," end quote. Other, less well-connected convicts had been burned at the stake or sent to rot in prison. Despite Galileo's relatively lenient fate, his condemnation energized science as an exercise in opposition to Catholic authority. As Jacob puts it, quote, "The writings of Galileo, his subsequent trial and condemnation, moved the new science to the forefront of learned discourse throughout Europe. In Protestant countries, support for Copernicanism could now be construed as anti-papal and hostile to the power of the Catholic clergy. What a splendid incentive for its adoption! This ideological linkage was to prove critical in creating the alliance between Protestantism and the new science." End quote. Henceforth, Northwest Europe, the Netherlands, France, and Britain in particular, would be the centers of scientific innovation. The different forms of that innovation in the context of these different societies, however, favored Britain's rise to industrial power. In France, the most influential philosophical reaction to Catholic tyranny was offered by René Descartes. In 1637, only 4 years after Galileo's condemnation, Descartes published his most famous treatise, whose full title was Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking Truth in the Sciences, often shorthanded as simply Discourse on the Method. It was in this treatise where Descartes established much of the foundation of modern philosophy, emphasizing rigorous skepticism toward claims to knowledge that began with his most famous reasoning, "I think, therefore I am." As Jacob writes, quote, "In Descartes' version of skepticism as a method, science became an unprecedented source of individual expression. Descartes offered the first intellectual synthesis of modern thought to rest entirely on the individual's ability to know nature." End quote. Through the rest of the 1600s and into the 1700s, Descartes' philosophy of science, known as Cartesianism, was critical in popularizing a rational approach to knowledge throughout Northwest Europe. His writing style was purposefully egalitarian, suitable for anyone with decent reading skills and some formal education. He was just as keen to rally women to the cause as men, and his message was explicitly designed to inspire people to think for themselves. Yet, his instruction on how to develop and verify knowledge, what historians call epistemology, was based almost entirely on deductive reasoning that he asserted could be derived from what he called innate ideas. Knowledge, in other words, was supposed to come more from within our own minds through math and logic than from anything outside ourselves, such as experimentation or observation, since our perceptions about the world, our senses, could be deceiving. This philosophical orientation towards science was initially all the rage, not only in France but in the Netherlands and Britain as well. Descartes' fundamental emphasis on skepticism and his insistence that logic and math were the surest roads to knowledge was as refreshing in an age of religious repression as it was easy to understand, at least in theory. In practice, however, it proved difficult for most people to do much with those basic scientific values besides use them as an intellectual shield against tyranny and superstition. Descartes, along with other mathematically gifted philosophers, may have been able to develop Cartesianism into more advanced theories of matter and motion and mind, but for the average person, Cartesianism was more about the principle of modern reason than its practice. In Britain, meanwhile, alternative philosophies of science were gaining steam, so to speak. Not literally yet, but they would soon. You get the idea. There, an English philosopher named Francis Bacon had been hard at work through the 1620s, articulating a vision of science that was much more utilitarian than anything found in the rest of Europe. In contrast to the high-minded theoretical abstractions of Cartesianism, Bacon focused entirely on developing simple, practical methods for using science to fix problems and enhance material prosperity, primarily through empirical investigation. Bacon himself loved to experiment with and investigate all manner of things, from the effects of ice on decay to the causes of hiccups, and he insisted that using all of the senses of sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste to explore nature was the best way to learn about it, albeit through a disciplined scientific method to organize data and help protect against the potential errors of sensory perception that would so preoccupy Descartes. Indeed, Bacon is often credited with being the father of the scientific method. This brand of science, often called Baconian empiricism, established a legacy of experimental, hands-on science within Britain that did not spread as readily to the rest of Europe, given how entrenched Cartesianism quickly became. It was inherently more practical than Cartesian science for people who lacked advanced mathematical or philosophical education, and Bacon was more adamant about its real-world applications, about how enterprise and the administration of society alike could benefit from adopting his scientific method. Now, the most important benefit of Baconian empiricism in terms of industrialization, according to Jacob, was that it naturally lent itself to the methodical study and improvement of machines. Mechanical devices of all kinds, from windmills and water wheels to clocks, were proliferating rapidly across Europe in the 1600s, and these technologies provided an immediate and rewarding focus of scientific attention for Baconian enthusiasts. You did not have to know advanced mathematics to take apart a water pump and rationally investigate its mechanism, and most of the time you did not have to be a genius to see how it might be improved. But if you could improve it, your effort would yield immediate profit. Bacon planted the seeds of an ethic of innovation in Britain, inspiring cultural respect for individuals willing to roll up their sleeves and investigate machinery, or practically anything else for that matter, for the profit of home and country. By contrast, Jacob writes, quote, "Relatively little attention was paid by Cartesians to mechanical devices intended for industrial application." End quote. Just about the time those seeds were planted, moreover, Britain experienced a major political upheaval that would intensively fertilize them. Quote, "No single event in the history of early modern Europe altered the fortunes of the new science more profoundly than the English Revolution. With the outbreak of civil war against Charles I, the 1640s became an exhilarating time for social reformers as well as for natural philosophers and scientific experimenters sympathetic to the parliamentary cause. Within the context established by revolution and civil war, modern science in its English guise was perceived in terms of its social usefulness and linked to a larger vision of reform and enlightenment. End quote. Anytime established authority is disrupted, there will be people who perceive opportunities for progress. And in Britain in the 1640s, the focus of that opportunity was on scientific progress. With the old monarchy and its religious extension of power through the Anglican Church overturned, quote, policing mechanisms in publishing and mores largely dissolved. The censorship of books, a function of established Anglican Church censors, largely disappeared. As a result, more books were published from 1640 to 1660 than in the entire rest of the century put together. End quote. Amid the English Revolution, then, suddenly, a couple of decades after Bacon explained his scientific philosophy, the seeds of Baconian empiricism blossomed among a whole new generation of acolytes eager to apply his practical scientific methods to the reform of English culture, politics, and industry. In 1660, the Royal Society, the world's first national scientific institution, was founded to help rationally steward England's restoration. The new parliamentary government would rely heavily on its guidance. And as Jacob points out, one of the most conspicuous ways that the Royal Society sought to deploy scientific progress was through technology that would deliver tangible economic gains. Quote, great emphasis was placed on technological improvements, on mechanical devices intended for industry and agriculture, and on learning from artisans. The inspiration for these projects was Baconian. End quote. Fellows of the Royal Society were not just exceptional philosophers and experimental scientists. They were keen political actors who understood that economic prosperity, especially in rural areas, would provide a bulwark against further political chaos. In fact, by the late 1600s, Britain's rural economy was already becoming an incubator for industrialization. Rural mining for coal and minerals, along with light manufacturing, were attracting some of the most enterprising people in the country who were eager to profit from the mechanization of power technology. Horsepower, windmills, water wheels, and of course human muscle were deployed at a greater scale in these rural industrial centers than most other places in the world by that time, and records from the 1680s onward indicate concerted interest within the Royal Society for rallying science specifically to the cause of industrial power. And Jacob argues that, critical for the subsequent history of the Industrial Revolution, the leaders of British science seized that moment afforded by England's Reformation to cultivate an entirely new cultural value toward mechanization. As Jacob writes, quote, the society was receptive at that time to what was to become a socially revolutionary argument. The fellows discussed the notion that mechanical devices could, and indeed should, save labor, in effect decrease rather than increase employment. At the time of those discussions, it was extremely difficult to get a patent from the government for any device if its inventor argued that it would save labor. Yet in the minds of the Restoration natural philosophers associated with the Royal Society, we can find a mentality discernibly industrial in the modern meaning of that term, and, most important, an eagerness to promote their vision of industrial progress. End quote. The idea that machines should save labor is taken for granted today, but 350 years ago it was revolutionary. By supporting this disruptive idea, Britain's scientific leaders of the late 1600s understood that they were shifting Britain's economic power away from landowning and commercial elites who dominated England's wealth since the Middle Ages, old money, and toward manufacturers, artisans, inventors, and venture capitalists, new money. But for Britain to retain both its scientific and economic momentum, this shift was deemed necessary and proved to be one of the most effective ways for Britain to remain competitive against continental rivals like France, which enjoyed a much larger population and much greater landowning wealth. This shift was just setting into place when Isaac Newton published his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy in 1687, solidifying the cultural authority and influence of modern science as we know it. With Newton's brilliant presentation of the universal laws of motion and gravitation, Jacob argues that science became a kind of natural religion in Britain. Quote, "Doctrines like transubstantiation or even the Trinity, as well as belief in the existence of hell, quietly slipped away. The laws of science vindicated God's existence." End quote. Studying science became an ever more conspicuous proxy for religion, the Book of Nature, as it was called, an ever more popular alternative to the Bible. Quote, "The model of order based on knowable laws embodied in the Newtonian synthesis offered a powerful alternative to a variety of other belief systems, not least to the doctrines of scientifically naive clergy. With the dissemination of the new science in the early 1700s through lectures, sermons, journals, and textbooks, all educated people were expected to know something about science." End quote. Since most people couldn't understand Newton's mathematical reasoning, physical demonstrations, especially with machines, was the most common form of science education in Britain, with Newton's laws summoned to showcase how mechanisms of every kind might be perfected. And in that spirit, quote, "The application of the new science could hardly be resisted. Indeed, it had been encouraged by scientists of the Royal Society as early as the 1680s. After 1700, ideology came to bear relation to reality, and simultaneously, the lectures of the London coffee houses moved into the provinces. The provincial academies also eagerly took up that science and replicated the lectures in their classrooms. By 1730, not incidentally, over 100 steam engines were at work in Britain. The scientific culture that gave pride of place to mechanics permeated Britain more broadly and deeply than any other place in Europe." End quote. So, half a century before the Industrial Revolution even began, the British had already established what historian Larry Stewart calls public science. And how refreshing this must have been for a population accustomed to centuries of arcane existential battles. Newtonian science wasn't just another philosophical theory. It wasn't just another religious war. No, it offered something that people could see and experience and personally profit from. Widespread, unprecedented mechanical progress confirmed the sentiment. In 1698, the English inventor Thomas Savery designed the world's first steam-powered water pump, which worked but proved impractical. In 1712, Thomas Newcomen used Newtonian mechanics and the science of vacuums to invent the first steam-powered pump that worked well enough for mine owners to actually buy. Then in 1776, James Watt was ready to install his first, dramatically more efficient steam engines throughout the mines of Cornwall, England. By then, Britain's Industrial Revolution was getting fully underway, and, quote, "mechanical science and the ideology of progress it promoted seemed to the leaders of mechanized industry the answer to all human misery." End quote. It took decades for other countries to catch up with Britain. The first lectures on Newtonian mechanics weren't offered at the University of Paris until 1740, by which time 2 generations of British entrepreneurs and engineers had been working assiduously together to apply Newtonian science to manufacturing, mining, metallurgy, and textiles production. Any literate British person, women included, Jacob emphasizes, could learn more about applied mechanics in a London coffee house than a privileged French or Dutch engineering student could learn at the best continental universities through the middle of the 1700s. Just as importantly, even after Newtonian science finally did permeate France, it remained the exclusive province of higher education. Unlike the British inclination to make science public, to democratize science, in other words, the French, at least until well after the Revolution of 1789, maintained an elitist approach to science and engineering. For example, Jacob writes, quote, "When asked in the 1770s to drain the harbor at Nantes, the military engineers and professors of hydraulics sent by the government found themselves described and treated as experts by the local merchants. There is not a shred of evidence to suggest that the engineers consulted with local entrepreneurs about their transportation interests or needs, nor were they asked to consult." End quote. By contrast, in Britain, most entrepreneurs took pride in being scientifically educated, and comparable engineering projects typically involved extensive conversations between business people and engineers in a shared language of scientific rationality. James Watt, the engineer, may never have been able to develop his world-changing steam engine had not Matthew Boulton, the businessman, shared enough of Watt's scientific understanding of the mechanical problem to back him. What both men understood above all was that science, the pursuit of new knowledge and ways of doing things, could be profitable. And this unique cultural conviction is what brought entrepreneurs and scientists and engineers together to create the Industrial Revolution in Britain and make it the richest and most powerful nation in history up to that time. The moral of Jacob's story is that, quote, "the widest possible dissemination of scientific knowledge, the democratization of learning, will do more to foster an indigenous creativity in matters of application or innovation than will the importation of foreign experts or the maintenance solely of elite cadres. The language of science must be capable of absorption by thought processes also expressive of other commonplace elements in a culture or society. If an aristocratic and closed system dominates in the academies, then theory may dominate over application, or science in general will receive less attention." End quote. Indeed, while many cynics today maintain that Britain became, for a time, the richest and most powerful nation in history for bad reasons, through conquest and colonialism and exploitation and oppression, Jacob reminds us that Britain earned its wealth and power for good reasons too, and making the pursuit of knowledge profitable, democratizing science by making it relevant to the material prosperity of its society, making science a public value, were among those good reasons. In my experience, academics and so-called intellectual elites of every stripe today, not so much in the hard sciences but in the social sciences and the humanities, too often judge the merit of their ideas by how hard they are for non-specialists to understand. This kind of intellectual elitism echoes what doomed France to lag so far behind Britain in Margaret Jacob's story. One of the primary goals of experts in any field should be to make their knowledge as relevant and useful to the rest of us as possible, because when that happens, our collective prosperity and intelligence increases, and when it doesn't, anti-intellectualism gains popularity. Next time on Context, we'll consider one of the most famous books on the history of science ever written, which has ironically done far more to complicate our understanding of science than clarify it. Thomas Kuhn's 1962 classic, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Lots of academic upstarts love citing Kuhn to argue that scientific progress, and even truth itself, are just illusions of Western conceit. Let's see for ourselves if his argument isn't just an example of counterproductive academic obfuscation. After that, we'll leave the history of science behind for a while to explore other factors in the rise of the modern world. I'm Brad Harris. So long.